Alright, so here we are in front of the elephants.
It was a pretty sunset.
Howdy, and welcome back to Film Asterisk. It's a chilly one out here in Burlington. We just got a foot of snow and it's only getting colder, but spring is not too far away. Today we're talking about Wendy Carlos, which may not be a name you know, but is one that's kind of synonymous with some of the most forward-thinking and breakthrough advances in synthesized music in the 20th century. Apart from being one of the pioneers of synthesized music up there with Moog and George Mattson, she's known for her iconic work in film, particularly soundtracks. Here is maybe one you might know. Oh, and here's another. And here is one more. Now those were the title tracks of Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange and The Shining, as well as 1982's Tron. Each of these films in their own ways represent a different cinematic triumph of its times, with the unrelenting adaptation of Anthony Burgess's novel Clockwork Orange, the sinister and visually iconic horror film The Shining, and also the techno-filled CGI gaming universe of Tron. None of these films would be the same without the sonic backdrop that accompanies them, all thanks to Wendy Carlos. Despite her impressive track record, however, these are really the only 3 films that she ever worked on. I mean, not a bad resume, having these and her numerous album releases of synthesized music, but in her credits of film, the record book only holds about 3 entries. Or do they? Because, in actuality, there is a 4th film that Wendy Carlos scored, a very obscure film in the late 90s, nearly 20 years after her previous film Tron, 1998's Woundings, or, for other international audiences, Brand New World, based on the play by Jeff Noon. Now, I must say in all honesty that the score to Woundings is not a lost one, just merely overlooked, or nearly completely forgotten, but the film itself has just fallen away beyond nearly all mentioning. Notable actors in the film include Guy Pearce, Ray Winstone, and Noah Taylor, even Twiggy. So, quite a British production. The film's Wikipedia page itself consists of the credits and a 3-sentence total description, which reads as follows. Brand New World, also called Woundings, a UK film based on Jeff Noon's play Woundings and released in 1998. It was filmed in Craignish, Isle of Man. The director, Roberta Hanley, won the Grand Jury Prize for Best Feature Film at the 2001 New York International Indie Film and Video Festival for the film. And that's all it says. No plot, no reviews, no reception, no production, nothing. So today, I'd like to take a look back and do some kind of investigative journalism and talk about Wendy Carlos's final film score in 1998's Woundings. Now, a little background on Wendy Carlos. Born Walter Carlos in 1939, Carlos studied physics and music at Brown University before moving to New York City in 1962 to study music composition. She eventually began work with Vladimir Yuzchevsky and Otto Luning, who were pioneers in a new kind of music that used computers and wires instead of traditional instrumental materials like brass, wood, and string. She began to work in Gotham recording studios to support herself and eventually in 1964 met Robert Moog and helped him develop what garnered probably the most attention of both of their exciting careers, an innovation of the first commercially available synthesizer keyboard instrument. The Moog mimicked a piano of sorts, but could be used for completely separate means. Carlos is credited with many of the synthesizer's most well-known uses, like a touch-sensitive keyboard, which allowed the player to add a volume based on the intensity of how the key was pressed, a portamento control, transitioning in between notes, and a 49 oscillator polyphonic generator bank that could create chords and arpeggios and play them with only pressing a single button, an instrument that could nearly play itself. Now, we here in the future are pretty used to the synthesizer keyboard, but over 50 years ago, this was a revelation in musical science, and Carlos would actually go on to win 3 Grammys for the synth work that would appear on many of her original studio albums, showing off the various synth instruments, as well as plenty of home studio recorded albums, made often on an 8-track recorder that she built herself since she couldn't afford the factory-made models. The big musical triumph for Carlos's early career came in the form of 1968's Switched on Bach. This is a recording of Johann Sebastian Bach compositions performed by Carlos on the synthesizer. Over the coming years after its release, it would peak at number 10 on the Billboard 200 album charts, number 1 on the classical charts, and was certified gold within a calendar year and platinum by the late 80s. Showing the album's long-standing reputation and effect in the music industry. All this culminated in her Grammy Award wins in 1970. Now, her music career would continue to blossom, experimenting with early ambient music and other electronic forms of composition, but all of this attention and success placed a lot of unwanted stress and worry on Carlos's shoulders, as from the release of Switched on Bach and into the early 70s, she was in the process of gender transition, which made any public appearance or performance incredibly rare, with only 2 known live performances documented. In the early years, she likened her Walter identity as a persona, but eventually completed her gender confirmation process and publicly announced her identity by the late 70s. This also made her the first transgender recipient of a Grammy Award. Wendy Carlos had now spent 10 years helping to revolutionize synthesized music, as well as meeting collaborators and equals like Robert Moog, as well as meeting Rachel Elkind in 1967 at Gotham Studios, a former singer and musician who would go on to help to be a large influence in Carlos's career. And although Elkind's first impressions of Carlos were quoted as being arrogant and confrontational, they became close friends and shared a home, a studio, and many projects throughout the years. So, what's next? It was at this time in the early 70s that not only did the music industry start to take notice of Carlos's work, but so did the film industry. And she was signed on to score 2 films, 1969's Marooned and 1971's A Clockwork Orange. A while into each of the film's process, the creative team behind Marooned eventually decided to have no score accompany the film, so Carlos, as well as Elkind, were left to collaborate with Stanley Kubrick, and Carlos was quoted saying the whole film was a lot of fun and a pleasurable venture, which is a bit of a contrast to the film's content itself. After her first foray into film scoring, she went on with her music career in the 1970s, releasing more albums in the unofficial Switched On series, such as the sequel to Switched on Bach, as well as Switched On Brandenburgs, and finished out the decade actually scoring short films for UNICEF, before reuniting with Stanley Kubrick for her second film score, 1980's The Shining. This collaboration went much less smoothly. As is a well-known film fact, Alex North's score for 2001: A Space Odyssey was famously scrapped. Instead, we have Kubrick opting to use the classical tracks that he had placed in the film as a substitute while editing. And Alex North didn't discover this until the premiere itself, when none of his music appeared in the film. Despite recording an entire score for one of Kubrick's previous films, Spartacus, he was shut out in 2001. And this experience was very similar to Carlos and Elkind's, but less dramatic, as only a portion of their score was used for the film The Shining instead of its entirety. Carlos and Elkind were extremely put off by this, especially when this proved to be Carlos and Elkind's final collaboration together, as Elkind moved to France with her husband in 1980. However, Carlos did not rest on her laurels as she teamed up with a new collaborator, Anne-Marie Franklin, and got to work on her third film score for the Walt Disney Company's new techno family action film, Tron. Now, Carlos agreed on the film on the basis of not purely composing electronic music, but incorporating her original compositions with a live orchestra. And one can argue her work on Tron, fusing her synthesizer roots with a larger scale orchestra, is probably one of her greatest triumphs as a composer. And beyond this point in Carlos's career, leaving the 80s, things slow down a bit. Her final album to date right now is 1998's Tales from Heaven and Hell, and she has spent most of her time just remastering her old classics and releasing just older unreleased tracks from various points of her now 50-year-long career. But within this scanter period of work, she collaborated on one final film, 1998's Woundings. Now, it's pretty difficult to find much on the film, especially stuff that was referencing it when it came out, as the easiest resources to track down are quoted describing the experience as this. In 1998, Carlos wrote the soundtrack to the British film Brand New World, also known as Woundings, directed by Roberta Hanley and based on the play by Jeff Noon. Carlos explained the style of her music. I was given fairly large carte blanche to do some horrific things and also did some indie psych mood paintings, and that's what the film became. Now, I actually tracked down the interview where that same quote originates, and she says that the film was a good experience. The sounds came out really well, we had a nice ensemble and some live singers, and when the film finally comes out, we'll put out the soundtrack album. And it felt like when I was reading this interview with her, it seemed like she was kind of returning to that same mentality that she had on Clockwork Orange, having a very positive, collaborative experience with the music and kind of being excited to move on with this portion of her career, film soundtrack, film scoring. But after Woundings, no soundtrack album was released, and Wendy has yet to score another film. So, what happened? Well, let's get into it with 1998's Woundings. Woundings is based on a play by Jeff Noon, and this is kind of the first thing that you really need to consider when trying to make sense of this movie, that it is an adaptation of a play. The story takes place in a not-too-distant future on a fictional island in the Atlantic Ocean. I imagine it's somewhere in between Ireland and Iceland, but the film in many ways feels like a commentary on the British invasion of the Falklands in the 80s. So it really could be anywhere. The British Army has invaded the island in an effort to free it from faceless invaders, and some battalions remain on the island as a peacekeeping force of sorts, and as the years after the war go on, they settle into the island more and more, relatively becoming permanent residents. So, the British government hatches a plan to offer women of the British Isles to go to the island and keep the soldiers company. The story follows 3 soldiers stationed on the island and 3 women who ship over to join them. The film begins with this striking, kind of surreal image of a man in a military uniform with sheep camouflage draped over him stalking a field before he is blown up by a landmine. It's a crazy image to kind of start the film off with, but fitting, as although the natural beauty of this island has remained after the war, the presence of the military forces afterwards have left this place kind of a death trap and a hollow shell of what it once was. The soldiers deal with intense PTSD, and their coping methods are less than healthy. The native women are spurned and grow bitter at their presence, and the native men spend their time in balls, getting drunk or harassing the newly arrived women. The governing force comes in the form of this stuttering and overwhelmed commanding officer known as the Colonel, played by Ray Winstone, who himself is a sight to see. All shaved head, looking and sounding perpetually in a stupor or off-kilter, suffering from severe migraines like James Cagney in White Heat. I think we're meant to think he has some kind of brain tumor. In some moments, he's balking nonsensical orders and mantras at his unattentive soldiers, and in other moments, he's confiding in them with his deep insecurity and confusion. It seems at times that all he knows is war, and being a war hero in peace times forces him to break down, lose his meaning, and lash out. The story follows all these people and their utter despair in life, and not having any prospects or hopes, and lashing out in dangerous ways. The power dynamic at play leads to the soldiers forming large egos and tyrannical social habits, taking what they please and pointing a gun at whatever denies them. all except our protagonist of sorts, Jimmy, played by Guy Pearce, who is this shell-shocked veteran who never fit in with the rest of the soldiers as much. I mean, he's not a drunk or a sex addict or a trigger-happy warmonger. Instead, in the scenes we actually see with him, he's trying to figure out his inner struggle of being trapped in this cycle of memory. Everywhere he walks on this island, something reminds him of the horrors that he faced in the war. Now, the film does a lot with a little to create this world, in my opinion, and although it's not really allowed to go far enough, probably based on budget constraints, what we get is fascinating. It's a sci-fi play set in a future world following regular British people, and it's very similar to Clockwork Orange in that way. And as it's a play, it really sticks to just a couple rooms and locations. The ball, some houses, a mess hall on base, the colonel's office and patio area, and the surrounding natural areas. But all these interior spaces are often populated with eclectic and striking wallpapers, set design, and costume design. I mean, these are rooms of everyday living dressed up in these weird, flashy colors, which, like Clockwork Orange, makes them somehow more bleak and sad than if we just got drab colors and grayscale tones in the film. The fact that in the future, society tries to block out the bleakness with tacky, cheaply made interior design elements makes it all the more sad, because it feels almost closer to our life, how humans would react to this bleak future, because we, like the characters, kind of see right through the facade. And this bleak world is supported by mixing the everyday with the intensity of military life. In one scene, one of the soldiers attempts to disarm a landmine in one of the dozens of red zones that have been flagged off as minefields. As he gently tries to disarm the device, we see the three women, who are kind of the female protagonists of the film, just casually looking on, as if for them this is just a regular afternoon outing. In one very telling quote said during the conversation between Guy Pearce's friends, Stan and Doug, "War replaces sex, and the war is never over. When we don't have any women, we can always just go back to war," is essentially what it's saying. I mean, it's this very self-destructive view of masculinity that really defines the film, and we see the women who enable it and the women who buck against it. The film at times also has a bit of a melodramatic air to it, and it definitely cheapens the experience, but I mean, there was a clear vision from the director. You can tell she's really trying to make something, but the budget just isn't there to be able to turn this into a truly immersive cinematic experience. The kind of experience that just envelops you. I mean, sadly, this has the production value of like a surprisingly good made-for-TV movie. And it certainly doesn't help that it was being shot so cheaply on digital in the late 90s, because the framing of the camera and overall cinematography is at times striking, yet it is coming through this low-quality digital lens, which is difficult to muster when you get through the first scene. And for many people who really expect that strong visual language to capture them right away, this film might land as dead on arrival. Woundings is certainly not the strongest adaptation I've ever seen. I mean, it has creative world building, but the tone of the original play that the film is trying to capture, I think it just may get a bit lost in being too faithful to the events of the original story. I get the sense that this play can't just be directly translated to the screen. I mean, what is obvious in a live play setting, I think becomes lost and confusing and muddled in this film. And I think Woundings could have worked to really create its own experience for the sake of more engaging filmmaking. And I say this because I do see this film having a lot of allusions to Clockwork Orange. And Kubrick, who is someone who's very well known for taking an adaptation and doing something much more cinematic and less faithful to the text, usually with very positive results. But as for Woundings, it just doesn't feel cinematic enough in execution or concept, despite many, many great little ideas that pop out throughout the film. Plus, you can see the boom mic in the top of like two of the shots, which is a bummer. But moving on, what of Wendy Carlos and her work on the film? I think perhaps in some ways this is honestly another achievement in her long career. I think from the early 60s, we see this very experimental and kind of sanitary use of synthesized music that really harkens to the earliest years of just learning how this instrument can be used, learning how this technology can be advanced. And if there's one person that we get to see a very unique evolution of the journey of learning how to make synthesized music, it's Wendy Carlos. And at this point in her career, it's 30 years down the line, and I think she's just able to work in the whole synthesized music world so differently than anyone else. She's been going down this rabbit hole for 30 years, and I think Tron was one of those film scores, one of those moments for her that really allowed her to open up and think about how she can take this purely synthesized music and convert it to be able to work with live orchestration and traditional instrumentation. And this is also the point when she really starts to add more to her personal compositions. She's not just doing covers of Bach and the Brandenburgs. Instead, she's going on and making her own work. I would say easily, this is some of Carlos's most dense, intricate composing to date, and it's not really until an hour in that we get kind of that signature style of Wendy Carlos, the kind of stuff that we're used to hearing in works like Switched on Bach. There's a scene about in the midpoint of the film where the Prince of England arrives to survey the island and boost morale, and his introduction is soundtracked by a synthesized version of the William Tell Overture. And this kind of stripped back sort of display of this track with the synthesizer, this is kind of what initially Wendy Carlos is known for, but beyond this point we've moved very far beyond this. We're getting much more nuanced music, I think. And right from the first scene, the opening credits, we get some of Wendy Carlos's soundtrack, and it's a powerful moment just listening to all the things Carlos is putting into her compositions. I mean, for me personally, there was always been something in the way she specifically synthesizes instruments, particularly trumpets and cymbals, that sounds like nothing else, like an uncanny valley of music. It's very intriguing. And within some of the vocal additions and more traditional synth instruments, we get this stuttering hits which add to the sinister atmosphere, as well as like these fluttering chimes that sound so haunted and lifeless. Now, I can say with certainty that this film is so lucky to have this music accompanying it, and without it, the film would perhaps be pretty insufferable, but honestly, most films would be without music. Now, Carlos's score is often placed back to back with these really booming 90s dance tracks, and it's a bizarre mix. Oftentimes it works well, but there are plenty of examples where it just doesn't. Take, for example, two of the night scenes around the midpoint of the film. These are kind of the titular scenes of the film because we learn what the woundings are. They are a series of fields on the coast of the island where a lot of the heavy battles took place and most of the soldiers died. Stan and Doug, Guy Pearce's two friends, take some women out to the fields to fool around with, and this is where this 70s soft jazz groove accompaniment comes in with the synth trumpet, as well as it has that kind of 90s dance flair to it. And overall, it's a very off-putting and weird moment, very kind of cheap synthetic music playing over it that doesn't have that natural gravitas that a lot of Wendy Carlos's stuff usually has. But even during those scenes, there are some fascinating juxtapositions, as one of the soldiers flashes back to some field only years earlier, that same one where he was in a foxhole fighting around the blown-up body parts of his fellow soldiers. And the insane contrast of the quiet, peaceful night of love-making he's having leads him to have this moment of genuine fear, and I think we're able to feel it too. Overall, I think I will say this for Wendy Carlos's score. Her music at so many times feels like the conscience of this film. Behind all the cheap, flashy colors and the military action and the drinking and the women, the score reveals a true tone of the film that creeps in when reality is revealed. It is a sinister and melancholy conscience, and it reminds us, war only breeds an aftermath that nearly none of us can afford. Now, it's a bummer that Woundings is so maligned, because despite its low-budget restraints, I think it does something kind of unique and optimizes pretty well on its few assets, which are the backdrop of the Isle of Man as a fictional island, the weird, cheap set design with a Clockwork Orange-like appeal, but much less meticulously crafted, Wendy Carlos' unapologetically weird and ear-catching score, and not to mention acting performances like Julia Cox as Angela, one of the native women, all poor protagonist Guy Pearce as Jimmy, and Ray Winstone as the Colonel, giving a pretty bewildering performance that I kind of need to watch like 5 more times to get a better sense of. But I certainly don't blame anyone who thinks this movie can't go far enough, because it just can't. But for what it can accomplish, for what feelings it does invoke, it's a really fascinating watch and a weird touchstone in a decade where the film community was in rapid transition, the 1990s. You know, it's funny, I actually looked up on Letterboxd to see how many people had seen this, and to date, 15 people have logged this film on Letterboxd. For reference, roughly 550,000 people have rated Clockwork Orange, and I am one of 15 who has gone back and watched Woundings, and I am the only one to rate it above 2.5 stars out of 5, which, fair. As for the legacy of Wendy Carlos, I mean, she has helped turn what was previously a musical science experiment in tones into a legitimate musical genre, a forward-thinking and new style of making music, a whole new perspective. And with the synthesizer, she went on to create some of the most iconic film scores in cinema history. I mean, look at Clockwork Orange alone. And with her passion for film scoring, it does seem like a tragedy that we never got another soundtrack or score from Wendy Carlos. And part of me thinks it's due to the lack of success and reception that came out of Woundings. The fact that I think it could have been something great. There were a lot of pieces there. And although we can look at it in a really interesting analytical light in retrospect, I think at the time it just didn't work. And perhaps it seemed like Wendy Carlos's musical stylings wouldn't really work in other movies either. I don't know. But her tracks for Woundings did thankfully finally show up on a compilation release called Rediscovering Lost Scores Volume 2, which included her unreleased work as well from Clockwork, Shining, Tron, the UNICEF films, and Woundings. And I'm happy to say that it is at least in some place where we can appreciate it for what it is. Now, I found a quote in that original interview about Woundings, which had also talked about her previous work, and she says of film scoring, "My heart is in this field, and I have kept my foot in the door to some extent, and now that I've done this film, Woundings, I think to myself that I might like to take another one on in a year or so. It's a lovely medium, and I can't see any reason for the snobbery that's been directed towards it." Me neither, Wendy. Me neither. But yeah, that is Woundings. If you have seen this film, wow. Congrats, you must be one of 15 people. But if you can find it, I had to find a very obscure eBay DVD seller of it. I think it is a worthwhile watch. And if you can't find the DVD, please, please, I implore you to go to Wendy Carlos's website and check out her scoring. Her music is truly affecting, and I've always appreciated that about her. But yeah, that's the episode. As always, if you want to hear about the movies we talked about during the Film and era, you can go to Connor's Letterboxd, Cranberry18 for seasons 1 through 4, and DA_N, my Letterboxd, for seasons 5 and 6. We have the Andes coming up soon. I'm very excited for that, to announce the winners of the Andes. Me and Connor, are recording that together, so probably until then, thank you for listening, and have a great rest of your week.